Hi everyone, it's Mr. Sinti, and today I'm happy to talk to you about macroevolution. Now, in our previous discussions, we've been talking about microevolution, which is small changes in a population, or in other words, the allele frequencies changing from one generation to another within a particular species. But in this video, we're going to answer Darwin's mystery of mystery, or at least begin to answer that question, which is how do new species arrive on the Earth? And so let's jump right into that conversation. And so one of the things about macroevolution, or the changes of species over time, is the fact that when Charles Darwin visited the Galapagos Islands for approximately a month, he knew that these islands would be a great place for the creation or genesis of new species because they were remote, and that he determined that there were organisms living on these islands that had to be immigrated there from South America or Central America. And so the fact that there are new species arising on these young islands would be the perfect breeding ground, if you will, to understand and study macroevolution, or the creation of new species. In other words, how do new species arise on the Galapagos Islands? Because obviously when they arrive, they're not a new species. They're the same as the ones that came from the mainland. So let's get into that. And so one of the primary examples of a endemic or a unique organism that lives on the Galapagos Islands is this gentleman right here, the marine iguana. It's the only seagoing lizard. It's quite unusual that a lizard be found going into the water, and the marine iguana does. It goes into the water to feed algae from the rocks, and it's kind of unusual. It's black coloration. It has these long claws for climbing up, and we believe that this dark pigment helps it to stay warm because it's cold-blooded and it's able to warm up and sun itself. And so the fact that the Galapagos Islands would be maybe the perfect place sort of helped Darwin crystallize or synthesize some of his observations that the plants and animals on the Galapagos, the species that live there, don't exist anywhere else. And so they had to have been created. And the Galapagos are young, just a few million years old, as opposed to the continent of South America, which is billions of years old. And so it's clear that new species can arise on the Earth, but how does it happen? Well, here's another example. For evolutionary theory to be accepted, you have to explain not only that populations, allele frequencies change in a gene pool or microevolution, but you have to explain how new species arise. Like, how did this flightless cormorant species come to be on the Galapagos Islands? How did it occur? And so when we say a new species, we have to get into that, because I can't just banter it around and say, new species are forming with the assumption that we understand what a species is. So let's address that. And so a species, what we mean by that is the word itself, it comes from the Latin meaning of the same kind or similar of appearance. And so that's kind of interesting, because historically this is how taxonomists, which are individuals that sort of characterize organisms, based their scheme. In other words, they categorize organisms based on appearance. And so, what organisms look similar, or in other words, their morphological outward appearance. And so we still use this somewhat today, but we have better and more sophisticated ways of defining what organisms look the same. Like, for example, if you look at homes on the street, you're like, wow, this home looks just like this home. This Victorian looks just like this one from the outside. But indeed, on the inside, maybe there's different bedrooms. Maybe one has a library inside. And so today we can look more internally to see who's a member of the same species. We can look at the different biochemistry. We can look at different behaviors to define this, or genetic makeup can be used to separate species. And one of the dilemmas about this is that if you look just at appearance, you might think, gee, these birds right here are pretty similar. Maybe they're the same species, but in fact, they're two different species. How can that be? And then even within the human species, sapien, it's like, look at all this diversity within the same species. And so you could be fooled if you look just like at appearance. And so what do we mean? What determines whether or not something is, in other words, what is the true defining element, biological definition of why these two birds are not of the same species? And so we have several different definitions of species. We have an ecological one, we have behavioral ones, but this is your classic biological definition of what a species is. And a species definition is a population whose members are capable of interbreeding. In other words, having living offspring, viable living offspring, and that those offspring are capable themselves of reproducing and having more children. And so reproduction becomes the sort of the pinnacle of whether or not one population is a different species from another. So in other words, let me sort of illustrate that simply. If I said that here's a population of organisms, and I'll call it species A, and then this is another population in species B. Why is this a different species than this? And the answer is there's some sort of reproductive barrier. So they're in isolation. In other words, A and B are not reproducing and having children with one another. And so the question in front of us is, how did that come to be? Because maybe once upon a time, B was capable of reproducing with A. In other words, if it was still a member of the A population. So my question is, in this particular video, is what are these reproductive barriers that prevent A and B from reproducing? And then we'll have to talk at a later time about what are the mechanisms that create this speciation event. But I just want to look at what are the reproductive barriers that prevent A and B from having offspring. And so, as I said before, species is based on infertility, not on physical similarity. So it's whether or not a population can interbreed is the definition of a new species. Because we don't want to solely base it upon appearance, because in these sort of meadowlarks, as I was mentioning before, they look pretty similar, but they don't reproduce. And if they don't reproduce with one another, by definition, they're a different species. And you're like, well, why don't they do it? Why don't they reproduce with one another? They may be able to physically, but maybe they don't like each other's bird songs. And so we're going to have to look at that. And then diversity is really intense in variation within a species, but it's still the same species if individuals are capable of interbreeding. And so the way we're going to approach these reproductive barriers is sort of look at them in two groupings. If we say that the gametes, both male and female, when they fuse together, they form the zygote, things that prevent populations from producing a zygote are what we're going to call sort of like the prequel or the something that comes before. These are the barriers that prevent a zygote from forming. And then even if a zygote is formed, there are some barriers that prevent the zygote from producing a fertile offspring. And so we're going to look at these as prezygotic barriers and postzygotic barriers that prevent gene pools from interbreeding. And so therefore there are two different species. And so we're going to first look at the prezygotic one. There are several. And if you can see this, it's kind of small, but we're going to go through examples of this. The prezygotic ones are temporal isolation, habitat, behavioral isolation, mechanical isolation, and gamete isolation. So let's take a look at those. So I'm going to mention this. I'll get into this concept a little bit later, but say these squirrels, for example, say members of the squirrel became separated from each other. One lives on this mountain range and the other one lives on this mountain range. Over a long period of time, even though they've been geographically isolated, that's not what we mean by reproductive isolation, because if these sort of lighter fur ones, these sort of yellow ones, were to go over to this mountain and they were to breed and have children, they'd still be members of the same species. This is at this point, even though the alleles look to be different, this is just an example of perhaps microevolution taking place. But I'm saying that over a long period of time, even if these squirrels come together in a similar range, and they still do not interbreed, in other words, there's some kind of reproductive barrier preventing them, then we can classify this squirrel and this squirrel as being reproductively isolated. So that's what we mean by reproductive isolation. They don't reproduce with one another and have viable offspring that reproduce, even if they live in the same range. And so, as I mentioned before, we can categorize these as either prezygotic or postzygotic. In other words, things that prevent the zygote from forming and things that happen to the zygote after. And so this is kind of graduated too. They're not just randomly placed like this. There's sort of an increase toward maybe they are the same species or they're not. And so that'll become clear as time goes by. So we're going to look first at these prezygotic barriers, and they hinder fertilization. In other words, they prevent the sperm from fertilizing the ova. And so one of the first things that I want to say about prezygotic is that even if organisms live in the same area, they may not live exactly in the same habitat, the same range, but not in the same habitat per se. Like, for example, in these snakes, you can have organisms, two organisms that use different habitats within the same geographic area, meaning that snakes can be found either, for this particular example of garter snake, can be found on the land, and then another population can be found mainly in the water. And even though they occur in the same area, they're unlikely to encounter each other, and so therefore they don't reproduce. And so they're considered to be two different species. And so what prevents them is habitat isolation. Now this is maybe a barrier that can be overcome. In other words, if you pull the snakes and you put them together, they might be able to breed. And so this is our first barrier. Now behaviorally, this is kind of interesting if you ask me. These are populations of organisms, and you would think, like for example, birds would be able to interbreed with one another. Come on, birds, you look very similar, but they may not like each other's behavior. They don't like what each other, they don't like the song, or if you're a firefly, they don't like the flashes. And so what we call these sort of displays to signify whether or not they want to reproduce are called courtship rituals. And so they're rather elaborate. And let me give you some examples of this. Let me show you over here. And so this is a picture of blue-footed boobies, and they have these interesting dances on the Galapagos Islands. But check this out. These are also some birds on the Galapagos Islands. They're called the waved albatross. And so check this out. So it looks like they're kissing or whatever that is, but it's a courtship ritual. And some birds don't like each other's courtship ritual, and so they will never decide to mate. And if that's the case, they're behaviorally isolated. They could reproduce, but they just choose not to behaviorally. And so they have these interesting courtship rituals. This is kind of sort of that smooching. If they don't like each other, they're not going to decide to mate.
That's new.
And so that's kind of, I find that kind of interesting. Also, I was mentioning these fireflies. Check this out. Like back over here, it says here that female fireflies flash back and attract males who first signal to them. And so there's like this coordinated sort of light show that goes on. It's almost like Morse code. And they have to like each other's light flashes, or else they won't decide to breed with one another. And so look at this. This is kind of neat. It's a synchronized flashes of light. And so they're sort of deciding whether or not they want to reproduce or not. And if they don't like each other's light, then they simply won't reproduce. And so that's kind of interesting. And so this is what we call behavioral isolation. It's when species use their behavior to either reproduce or not reproduce. And then this is another interesting prezygotic barrier, in that organisms might be able to reproduce with one another, but they don't because they're temporal or time isolated. So a couple of examples of this. Two species, so two different ones, may breed at different times of the day. And if one's a nighttime breeder and a daytime breeder, they're never going to encounter each other. And so therefore, they're reproductively isolated. And I know you're thinking, well, this could be penetrated, but in fact, these examples exist. Maybe they have different mating seasons, and so they just don't reproduce. or different times of the year. And so what's interesting, an example of this are these skunks, that the western spotted and the eastern spotted. They overlap with one another, but they're two different species because one mates in the late summer and one is in the winter. And so therefore they're isolated, they don't breed. And then same thing with these frogs. Like the wood frog and the leopard frog, they might be capable of reproducing physically, but they don't because they have different mating seasons. And so therefore they don't encounter each other. And so that's an example of temporal isolation. And then mechanical would be that simply the reproductive organs are not compatible, they're not fitting. And so if they're anatomically incapable of mating, then you won't be able to have sperm and egg meeting together. And so they just simply don't fit. And so insects are kind of a great example of this, but I'm going to go flowers here. Sometimes flowers in different plant species, the anatomy of a flower is a little bit different. And so if the flower is slightly different from one flower to another, perhaps they're pollinated by different kinds of insects that only feature that particular flower because they've co-evolved together. Therefore, pollen will never go from one population to another because you have these certain unique insects that are coming to your flower. Like for example, there's something called the black sage and a white sage. It's a type of flower. And so they're structurally different. And so they're pollinated by different insects. And so if they're pollinated by different insects, this is what we mean by mechanically they're isolated from one another. They'll never be able to reproduce. Although they might if you were able to interfere with this and like transfer the pollen yourself. And so this is an example of mechanical isolation. But then the next level would be gamete isolation. Like if you were to transfer the pollen, maybe the sperm doesn't fuse with the egg, and we call that gamete isolation. Like for example, you can't just simply in a petri dish pipette sperm from one animal and have it fertilize the egg of another. As it turns out, that the sperm may not be able to penetrate the egg, and there's unique reasons for that. There's enzymes found on the tip of the sperm that have to be specific to the egg that it's trying to fertilize. And maybe even the internal environment is not conducive. And so gamete isolation, a great example of gamete isolation is there's two different species of sea urchin. Like here's one that's purple and here's a red one. As it turns out, though they produce sperm and egg, the sperm and egg never fertilize because it turns out that the surface of the egg and the sperm aren't able to interact with one another, and so we call that gamete isolation. So the next level would be, okay, well, let's continue with this. This is what we mean by sperm and egg not being able to interact, and that the egg's surface is not compatible with the sperm. And so this is what we refer to as gamete isolation. So collectively, all of these represent what are called prezygotic barriers. Prezygotic. So it's behavioral, it's habitat, it's temporal, it's gamete isolation and mechanical isolation. But let's just say that all of those have been penetrated. And so the organisms are together, they have the same mating season, they have the same reproductive organs, and so they produce sperm and egg, and then the sperm and egg produce the zygote. And you're like, there it is, they're the same species. No, not necessarily, because then we have a list of, there's 3 postzygotic barriers. And what we mean by that is that if the sperm were to fertilize the egg, maybe the zygote, when it's developing inside the female, it fails to develop. And so what we call that organism is the hybrid. So it's kind of a combination of the two parent. So the hybrid fails to develop. In other words, it's aborted. The organism isn't able to have children, even though she became pregnant. Do you follow that? The zygote fails to develop, and so we call that reduced hybrid viability, i.e. the hybrid organism that was created is not living. And so, or in some rare cases, it is able to be born, but then it dies immediately because it's very frail. And then the next level would be, how about this? Probably most people on the street have heard of this example. Like, for example, do you know how you get a mule? You get a mule from crossing two different species, and you're like, wait a minute, I thought that two different species don't reproduce. That's the definition. Well, yeah, a horse can, they don't do this naturally because in nature, again, there's probably some other behavioral, like they don't like each other. They're not going to want to reproduce, a horse and a donkey. But how do you like this? People like to interfere with this. And so we've crossed a horse and a donkey and we've created a mule. And you're like, well, wait, this means that they're the same species. No, it doesn't. Because even though the mule was created, it's sort of like the F1. This is considered to be the hybrid or the mule. The F1 or the hybrid is infertile itself. In other words, it can't reproduce. And so remember the definition of a species, biological definition, is that the offspring must be fertile. And so the mule is not fertile. And so it's sort of a dead end. Even though it's a strong organism, it's rather robust, and we use it to, humans use mules a lot for help carrying things, etc. And so what's interesting is the mule is sterile, so therefore a horse and a donkey by definition are two different species. And what's interesting is you can't even backbreed it. Well, in other words, a mule won't reproduce with a donkey and it won't reproduce with a horse. There's a few exceptions to that. Sometimes they will do that, but generally they do not do that. And so why is it? Maybe it's because in the mule there's a problem with meiosis, or there's abnormal chromosome numbers, and therefore they weren't able to reproduce, backbreed with the two parental species. And so nevertheless, a mule is a sort of an artificial organism because it's a hybrid, but it's infertile. And then finally, the last example is, okay, so you have an offspring, it lives, like for example the mule, and then it has another generation, in other words the F2, and then that is infertile. So you almost had it. So it's kind of like a breakdown. It's called hybrid breakdown. So in some instances, the first generation hybrid is alive and it is fertile. So you've crossed those first two. But then it becomes feeble or sterile. And so there's an example of this in plants in cotton, whereas in the second generation, the plant refuses to produce seeds and it becomes weak and it dies off. And so those are the examples of reproductive barriers or reproductive isolation. There's prezygotic ones and postzygotic ones. And those prevent gene pools from interchanging. In other words, new species. And so I hope you enjoyed that, but I hope there's a little bit of a cliffhanger, because the real question is, where did these reproductive isolations, how did they come into being? How do new species evolve? So in other words, we know why one species doesn't reproduce with the other, reproductive barriers, but how did reproductive barriers come into place? You might know it, but if not, stay tuned for the next video on speciation. I hope you enjoyed this video on reproductive barriers. Thanks for watching.